finish off chapter 14 today, talking about some changes in society to make things better for people. And then we'll finish up with whatever time it takes us. I'll give you your quiz. The chapter 14 quiz is on paper, and it is due Wednesday for white class and Thursday for purple class. So we'll be ready to start chapter 15 later in the week. So quiz due Wednesday if you're a white kid, Thursday if you're a purple kid watching this video. All right, so we should be ready to start with social reform with the idea of temperance, as the screen is frozen, of course. Time out. Ignore the long pause here, video watching people. What's going on here? Oh, there we go. Computer's a little slow today. Just in case anybody wants to know, I let Angela borrow my computer earlier, and that made it really slow. Okay, so the idea of temperance means little or no alcohol. It's a pretty model idea for the time, but we're looking at issues. You know, look at the picture. Drinking leads to neglect of duty, moral degradation, and crime. To a certain extent, could we say those things are true today? It does. It depends on the person. So drinking in moderation or drinking just a little bit for an adult person probably doesn't cause any of those things, but drunken people certainly do cause those issues. So we were looking mostly at the tearing down of the American family because of alcoholism. And we're talking alcoholism, not just drinking of alcohol, but it is a campaign. If we get rid of alcohol, it gets rid of a lot of problems. Even think from today's perspective, the percentage of car accidents that are caused by drunk drivers, the percentage of people that have died in car accidents that are caused by drunk drivers. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's a gigantic percentage. So if there was no alcohol, we'd have no drunk drivers, we'd have fewer accidents. If we had fewer accidents, we'd have fewer people dying from accidents. What would happen to my cost of my automobile insurance, my car insurance, if we had no alcohol? It would go down because there'd be fewer accidents, fewer worries for me. As a dad with a 16-year-old driver, it's not her driving that I worry about that much, it's the other people's. And if she's out at 10 o'clock or 10:30 at night, I worry that the other people might have been drinking. So you can see that it impairs your ability to think. And some of you that haven't been around alcohol very much, maybe mom and dad don't drink very often, maybe you can't see it, but I work at a bar doing security a lot in the summer, and it's kind of interesting to see when people come in how they act as compared to when they leave 3 or 4 hours later after they've had sometimes too much to drink. They're not okay to drive. They don't have the ability to think as quick as they think they can. Their brain's telling them, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. But we got people that go home and they beat their wives or beat their husbands. That oftentimes is left out, but male abuse is a common thing in relationships too. So that's probably the big thing. We're not talking in the 1800s about drunk drivers. That's just a modern day example. But moral degradation and crime, breaking the law, doing stupid things because you're drunk and you don't know what the right thing to do is, that's pretty common. So the idea of banning alcohol is a thing. Now, if someone came to me today and said, Mr. Bellamy, we're going to make alcohol illegal, okay. Because I don't drink alcohol very often and I don't need it. But if you're an alcoholic, you need that stuff all the time. Plus, on top of that, what tends to happen to stuff in America, probably everywhere, but when we say you can't have it, you want to have it. It's sort of a challenge. When mom and dad say, no, you can't stay out till 10 o'clock, it's almost like a challenge for you to figure out how to stay out till 10 o'clock. It's sort of maybe comparable. This maybe is not a great comparison, but marijuana is illegal in America. Some states have passed state laws that allow it, but there's federal law that says it's not legal. So someday that's going to come to a clash, or it'll just go away. But in Nebraska, for sure, marijuana is illegal. Does that mean you can't get it? I'm not asking for How many of you know someone that has access to it? But is it available? Yes, it is. Do you think you have to look really hard to get your hands on it? Probably not, unfortunately. But just because something is illegal doesn't mean we don't do it. It's against the school rules to chew gum. Yet many of you do it. Why is it that you get away with chewing gum if the school handbook says no gum in school? It's not that big of a deal, and I'd probably get in trouble because this is on video, but how many teachers enforce that rule? Some, but not very many, right? Unless I'm angry with you or you're I don't like to see it. If you're smacking your gum and your mouth is flying open, unless that's the case, I'm probably going to say, whatever. I'm just going to ignore the fact that you're chewing a piece of gum in my class. Unless I start seeing it underneath desks or stuck on the wall or stuck in somebody's hair. Morgan would look really bad if she had to cut out like a great big chunk of her hair because someone stuck a wad of gum in it. I shouldn't say that. Morgan, you would look fine if somebody had to cut out a big chunk of your hair because someone stuck a wad of gum in it. Don't do it. It's not nice. Anyway, so that's the problem that we've got is temperance is getting rid of alcohol. It's really difficult. Maine tries it. There are actually, I think, 5 counties in Nebraska where alcohol is illegal to purchase or sell. So you can't go to the Quickie Mart in those 5 counties. They're small rural counties, but you can't go to the Quickie Mart and purchase alcohol. There are probably half of the state of Nebraska it's illegal to purchase or sell alcohol on Sundays. Doesn't mean you can't drink alcohol on Sundays. It just means the stores won't sell it. It used to be that way everywhere, but the laws have loosened up a lot. So, but Maine is the first to outlaw it. Now we'll try it as a social experiment in the 1920s. The United States will pass an amendment to the Constitution. The 18th Amendment says alcohol is illegal. And for almost a decade, almost 10 years, alcohol was against the law in America with very few exceptions. Like in medicine, alcohol could be used, and the church had permission to use alcohol. Why would the church have permission to use alcohol? In communion. So most of your churches, many of your churches, if you take communion, it's a little teeny tiny miniature cup of wine, or sometimes you'll drink it straight from the chalice, though I think that that's a crazy thing that still exists in my church, but I think it's kind of a crazy thing with COVID that you got a whole congregation of people drinking from the same cup. You're wearing masks. You take your mask down so you can drink out of the same cup as some other slimy looking guy. First of all, I don't want to drink out of the same cup as any of you because some of you probably didn't brush your teeth. I thought you meant drink out of the same cup. Just look around you. At any given moment, there are 5 people in this room that did not brush their teeth today. Guarantee it. So you want to share a cup with strangers that you can't tell? I know, it's gross, isn't it? So, yeah, anyway, not a COVID debate, but kind of weird. So, yeah, churches could still. But anyway, you got these women that are busting down places, and most of this is probably going to come from the 1920s and 1930s, where their prohibition takes place. Alcohol is illegal. So these women just go in and start hatcheting things up. This woman, she's not in this chapter, and this slide probably should go away. In fact, there's a question on your test that I'll explain. Her name is Carrie Nation, and she walks around with a Bible in one hand and a hatchet in the other, and she walks into speakeasies or bars and just starts cracking open. Kegs of alcohol were made of wood at the time, so just start busting them open with a hatchet and letting it spill all over. And you think, well, who would let her do that? You gonna get in her way? I think not. She's kind of fearsome looking, so
In the Viking Age?
maybe. I don't know, but nobody seems to get in the way of these women that are poor. But it's the temperance movement is really, really pushed by women and priests or preachers because they believed that it was causing moral degradation of society. We were having issues in society. Of course, it's true, but take away alcohol and it creates other issues. So this one I think is kind of funny. This poster: lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. So. No smooching on those ladies if you drink. You think, just looking at the... Ladies in the picture, you think that scared a lot of men off?
No.
Probably not. That looks like, okay, just follow with me on this. If you had to picture Edward's wife in 30 years,
Why me?
it just fits. I don't know. Or Andrew's wife in 30 years. She's pretty.
There's a couple of dudes in there.
Well, he kind of looks like it, but why not? Whatever you identify as, you be you. But the Devil's Toboggan Slide all has to do with speakeasies and dodgery and saloons and gambling and corruption, and that leads to an early graveyard. And all of those things may or may not be true. Now, this is kind of a fun story. So, in the mid-1800s, people started forming what they called utopian communities. Now, think about it for a minute. If you had to create a perfect place, so let's say that you got, let's say you can have the western half of Nebraska, or a great big territory, and it's got all the resources that you need to survive and maybe even prosper a little bit. And you can take all your friends with you and you want to create a perfect place. What would the rules of this perfect place be? Because we live in a good place, but it is by no means perfect. You're not going to find perfect probably anywhere in the world. So what would the rules of a perfect place be, of a utopia be? I'm asking a question, so I would prefer responses. No hate, no hatred at all. Not just speech, but no hatred, right? So everybody if we're going to form an ideal community, a utopian community, then we all just got to let each other be and we all get along. If we disagree, we got to agree to disagree. We don't have to fight about it. We can disagree, but we don't have to hate on each other. Doesn't matter who we are or what we are. So that's a good one. Which also, if we're looking at utopian communities back then, means that they're typically formed out of people that are like-minded, because it's a lot easier to not have any disagreements or any hatred amongst each other if you all think the same way, which probably means that it's not a utopia for most of us. What else? Everybody has plenty to eat. Everybody has a job. Everybody has a place to live. No murderers. No extreme lawbreakers. Do those seem like relatively acceptable rules in our utopian society? Probably would seem that way. The problem is, can that exist? Or if it does, what kind of government do we call it today, where everyone is equal and everyone has the same stuff and everyone has a job and everyone has the same house and everyone's provided with an automobile and everyone's provided with health care and everyone's provided with all of their basic needs? What kind of government do we call that? That's communism or socialism, depending on which terminology we would like to use. So anyway, we have a bit of an issue with that. It doesn't tend to work for most of us. America is what's called capitalist. So I know, for instance, that if I work harder than everyone else, there's a really good chance I'm going to get more than what everyone else has. I don't want to be equal to everyone, because if that's the case, really, is Daggett going to do his fair share of work if he knows he gets a car and a house and everything taken care of? No, he's going to sit around and watch hockey all day. Whatever. You're weird, so you probably watch a lot of hockey. Nobody really understands that sport in Nebraska. I'll watch it, but it's like, it's kind of like if you don't know what's going on in soccer, there's rules that are like, what? That's stupid. Anyway, so that creates a bit of a problem for us, is we got slackers. So there are some ideal communities, some utopian societies that have been created in America that still exist today. I'll go over kind of the history of some in a minute, but when I was in college, we went on a field trip to South Dakota. In South Dakota, there are a couple of, they call them communes, kind of like communism, communes of people called Hutterites. Hutterites look just like the people in this picture. They're very, very, very simple. Now, you might think Amish, but the Hutterites don't shun things like electricity. They do shun technology, but they will take advantage of it sometimes. So we were in a sociology class. Sociology is the study of other people. It's rather interesting if you have to take a social studies class and you don't really care for history, sociology or psychology or social studies or economics. Those are social studies classes too. Probably won't have to worry about that until college because you're stuck with history in high school. But we visited these two Hutterite communes, and the first one we went to was the most interesting. It was old school. Like all the women wore dresses that looked like this, and all the men had, they looked like what you picture Amish people looking like on television. And the Hutterites and the Amish are closely connected, mostly of German ancestry. In fact, the Hutterites in South Dakota that we saw spoke German. They also could speak English, so they could communicate with us because we were just a bunch of regular college students taking a sociology class. But we had an appointment to meet with these people, and they're usually a little bit private. But because it was a college class, they were going to share some of their culture with us. So we're all excited about this. So we drive down this little dirt road, and we get there, and there's horses and wagons, but there's also some pickup trucks. And so they use some technology. And we get there to meet with these people, and we're expecting like the mayor or someone. There's 110 people maybe that live in this community, men, women, and children. We're expecting like the mayor or town council or someone to come out and meet with us. Instead, they sent a 13-year-old girl to give us a tour. Why do you think they would do that? Part of it's because they were off working and the 13-year-old girl wasn't. And they never said this straight out, but when we asked questions about the appropriate questions, understand we were college students, about the strangeness of their lifestyle, the 13-year-old girl couldn't answer a lot of our questions. So I think it was strategic on their part that they sent someone that didn't know the answers so they could avoid answering them. So it was really kind of neat though, but they lived in dormitory style housing, so everybody had the same apartment, and they ate in a cafeteria, kind of like our cafeteria, except it had the big long tables, and each family took turns preparing the meal for the community. So this week it might be the women in this row, it's your responsibility to make the meals for the week, and then next week it's the women in this row, and typically the men would go off to work. So it is they still exist. It is paternal. It's all based on the man. I can't think of the word that I want to use. Maternal, paternal, I don't know. Anyway, I'll think of it in a minute. But the women didn't have very many rights. In fact, very few people in the community had rights. So let's say, for instance, and we all live as separate families, but we all have dormitories. Let's say that I need soap and toothpaste. Don't need groceries because the community takes care of that. I have to put it on a grocery list, and then once every month, one of the elders, one of the old men, or a couple of the old men, will go to town and they'll buy soap and toothpaste. So they make the decisions as to what we actually need. Or let's say my daughter Morgan breaks her arm. I don't have to have health insurance because we've got a community of 100 and some people that all own the land and we all work the land together. So when someone has a medical issue and she needs care, we take her to town to the hospital, and instead of giving them an insurance card, we just write a check to pay for it. So they share in all of the bounty and they share in all of the tragedy together. It was really kind of neat to see, but yet at the same time, difficult for us to think about because none of us really want to think about being the minimals. We want to think about getting more than we've got or doing better than the next guy. We're very competitive. Right or wrong, we're very competitive. So the Shakers were originally founded in England in the 1700s and kind of came to America by about 1780. Their actual name isn't the Shakers. Their actual name, I wrote some notes. I can't find them. Oh, here they are. Don't worry. Told you I did homework. Their actual name is the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. It's hard to read that guy's handwriting, isn't it? Yeah. So, yeah, we'll go with Shakers. They were called Shakers because when they had prayer service, they would oftentimes quake or shake because their services were so intense. So you can imagine going to church and everyone's like, ah, 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 ah. Okay, that's weird. But weird to us and weird to them are two completely different things. So they have a set of behaviors that they're very familiar with. Women had leadership roles in the church along with in society. So for the Shakers, women were equals to men. Um, they were celibate. So if you decide you want to join a Shaker commune, you have to pledge celibacy. Celibacy means you will not have sexual relations with anybody. Anybody see a problem with that? Yeah, if there's no sex within the community or no marriage within the community, and I'm not sure if marriage existed, it may have. But if there's celibacy and celibacy only, you have no children. What happens to your community over time?
You all go extinct.
Yeah, it goes extinct. So what they did to make up for that is they took in orphans. So children who didn't have parents, they just adopted them. The Shakers were really good about that. So that's how they kept their societies growing. They were communal, which means they shared in everything and nobody was more important than somebody else. They were pacifist, which means they refused to fight. They had equality among the sexes. They believed they were utopian, which means a perfect society, and they believed in simple living. At the peak of Shaker society in the mid 1800s, there were 2,000 to 6,000 Shakers in 18 separate communities. Sort of like the Hutterites that I'm talking about in South Dakota. We visited 2 communes. The first one was very, very old school. So they had one telephone in the entire community for 100 and some people. No cell phones, no devices like that. They had a couple of pickup trucks because they were farmers. They had a few small tractors because they were farmers, and they had a couple of gigantic barns of turkeys. They raised turkeys. That's how they made their money. They were relatively modest, but because they shared everything, they didn't have really any concerns. The second commune we went to was completely different. So we pull in, and they have their own gigantic grain elevator with these huge grain bins, and they're driving tractors that would make Aiden want to cry. These are big and amazing, gigantic tractors. And everything is computerized. And then you go into their houses, and again, one phone. They had one TV in the whole community, and that's only because the state of South Dakota demanded that they have school. So they had to provide a teacher. So half a day, every day, a teacher from the state of South Dakota came in and taught the children, and the other half a day they learned German on their own with their own teachers. But really, really interesting community. But so they weren't well liked amongst their neighbors. They were peaceful people and they didn't cause any problems. But because they shared all of their property, when they harvested a crop, it went into one big bank account. So nobody was any wealthier than anybody else. The problem that they had with the neighbors is anytime somebody's land came up for sale and they wanted it, can anybody outbid them? You couldn't. So the Hutterites could consume everything in their area because they were super successful at what they were doing. Shakers didn't really have that big of a problem. There were only 18 communities total at the peak. By 1820, there were only 12 communities. And in 2019, there was one Shaker community left in America in Maine. Anyone want to guess how many members there are in the Shaker Society today? 2. That's it. Did it say that up there? Wowzers. And that's 2020, and this is 2022. And they were old ladies when I looked that up in 2020. So there's a good chance that there are 0 Shakers left.
Probably
2005. So go with this. I don't think it asks you on the test, but go with mine. It's updated a little bit more. But it's kind of neat to think about. You know, if we could go off and create a perfect society, what would our perfection look like? For much of history, it's had to do with money and finances and food and survival. For us, Our attitude changes. The first thing that comes out is no hating or no prejudice, since it's a term that we use earlier in class in this chapter. So I'm not sure what our rules would look like if we sat down and made a list of 10 rules of our utopia. Would we be pacifists, refuse to fight? Would we be based in religion, or would we create our own religion? Would we allow marriage? What would we do? It'd be kind of nice not to have any screaming kids running around. Wouldn't be much of a job for teachers. Factory life and workers' rights. Some of these things we deal with today. By the 1830s, workers were starting to figure out that they didn't have to work for $8 a week or pennies on the hour, and they're demanding a 10-hour work day instead of 12 or 14, 6 days a week. They were getting low pay, the jobs were dangerous, there were no safety precautions taken. So I've been working at a security job. I worked Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, 12-hour shifts, so I worked a lot. I didn't take any time off over the 3-day weekend because I like to get paid. But the place I work is a factory set up, and everything there is safety, safety, safety. Everywhere you go, they got hard hats on. There's extra safety equipment. There's fire extinguishers. That's the difference between then and now. All of that safety equipment costs the company money. So if we get rid of all of it, it'd save the company a lot of money. The company would be much richer, but you also end up with more dead people or more wounded people. And back then in the 1800s, there was no safety net to help people that were too poor to take care of themselves. So if you lost your arm in an industrial accident working at the factory, you're probably going to have to live in poverty for the rest of your life. So safety, safety, safety. So workers are starting to demand, we don't want to work 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. How about 10? So they're requiring employers give in a little bit. Can you imagine 6 days a week of 14 hours a day? Those are some long days. So they start to create what's called a labor union. It's a group of workers who band together to seek better working conditions. That's very simple. Here's the thing. If I'm standing in the hallway and you guys see on this thing that we're doing a test today, and one person comes up to me and says, Mr. Bellamy, that's not fair. We're not ready for a test. My response is, well, I guess you should have been ready. If 24 people come up to me and say, Mr. Bellamy, this really isn't fair. We're not ready for a test. My response has to be a little bit different. Like, oh, what do we need to do to get you ready? Or, oh, really? Do you all feel that way? Maybe we should push the test back a day. So when you're united as a group, you're much more powerful than you are as an individual. If you come to the boss of the factory as an individual and you say, boss, I'm refusing to work more than 10 hours a day, what happens? You're fired, because it's easy to replace one person. If the whole factory comes to the boss and says, hey boss, we refuse to work more than 10 hours a day, can the boss fire all of you? Can, but it's awful difficult to fire and replace all of you, depending on what kind of skills are required to replace you. So that's really difficult, which makes labor unions very, very powerful. And they came up with a new term here. They'd stop working to demand better conditions. It's called a strike. It's a peaceful thing usually. So if you see strikes today, they show people outside the factory with signs that say, we want better rights or we want better pay. You can go on strike for almost anything. And sometimes they're successful. About every other year, this is kind of funny, I think, Chicago, it'll be on the news in about August. They're not very smart there, apparently. They wait to settle their teacher contracts until August, right before school starts. And the teachers, if they don't like the contract, they just go on strike. So about every other year, because I think they must do 2-year contract. We do 2-year contracts in Blair, so we won't have to worry about it every 2 years. About every other year, you'll see on the news, Chicago teachers are on strike, no school tomorrow. You got to think, if you're a student in Chicago, you're like, yeah, teachers. But that'll never happen here because our state law makes it illegal for teachers to go on strike. So Yeah, we can. And actually, in Blair, Nebraska, even if your teachers were upset about the working conditions or the pay, most of your teachers teach because they love teaching. We're not going to stay home and go on strike. So it won't happen here, but it's a very powerful tool. If you're being misunderstood at work, if you can organize a group of people, it's pretty easy to get the group to give in demands. And ultimately, it usually ends in some sort of compromise where this is always how every year when teachers negotiate with the school board, that's who ultimately our bosses are. So yes, I have Mr. Wazorik and Mr. Schwartz and Dr. Gilson, but then the school board is ultimately on top of all of those. Um, if I have a complaint, then I can take it to them, but most of the time it's resolved before it gets to the issue where the union needs to step in. Other things, we got this guy named Horace Mann. Horace, it's a good name. Nobody names their children Horace anymore. No, it's a solid name. Horace. Horace. I think it's nice. Anyway, he calls public education the great equalizer. There are very few places in the world where there is equality. So when you come to school, I like to think that at least in my class, and probably not in all classes, but it doesn't matter what color you are, it doesn't matter what sex you are, it doesn't matter any of that. You all get the same opportunity in this class to be successful. If you do what I ask you to do, and you learn what I'm teaching you, and you show up, it is an equalizer. So it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, you get the same opportunities as each other. So this guy says we got to be better with public education, making sure we provide our students with high quality teachers and high quality curriculum so that they're good and prepared for the future. Is he wrong?
Yes.
How so?
Because
In here?
this
Come
curriculum
on.
doesn't seem too useful.
My curriculum doesn't?
No, like
Mongoose.
yours is fine.
Maybe you should have clarified that before you made me angry.
Some of the others though, I'm kind of
I'm not going to disagree with that. I get that.
Who's gonna look up in the night sky and just say, "Ooh, that's a waning gibbous."
Yeah, I did that. I did that.
See, she did it. She's like, oh, a waning gibbous. I don't know what you guys are talking about. It sounds really nerdy, but good for you. All right, so we got Horace Mann. Education is the equalizer. The thing is, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. You know what a waning gibbous is. I don't. I do kind of remember learning that stuff, but it's not anything that's stuck in my brain. Okay, that was information that I don't need that in my brain right now. So
I've been out of that.
if someone says look it up, okay, I got a phone, I can Google it. So
I haven't seen that information for 3 days now.
yes, get through it, and then I guess here's the thing: if you maybe you're going to go into be an astrophysicist, then something like that is the seed that might get you started. But for the majority of you, even do you have to know the stuff? I think you do, because I think you have to have a better understanding of our history to avoid problems in the future and create a better future for us. But apparently social studies teachers are the only ones that believe that. And maybe even some of you get that, because you get the least amount of this of all of your classes. It doesn't make any sense. And we spend more time, shouldn't be recording this, we spend more time on algebra and stuff that you may or may not ever use in your useful life, but yet we turn students out of the middle school that don't know how to balance a checking account or how to budget money, which those seems to be things that we all need to know. In high school, there is a financial literacy class. They just created it and required it 2 years ago, and I'm like, yes, because Americans are notoriously really bad with money, so we should fix that. We got Dorothea Dix, works hard to promote better care for mentally ill. Mental illness is an area where we still have weaknesses today. It's hard for people who don't have a mental illness to understand mental illness. It's almost always in history been seen as a major weakness when it is a disorder, just like if you're sick. It is a sickness that needs to be treated. So Dorothea Dix traveled from mental hospital to mental hospital. And understand, back in the day, all the way up even into the early 1900s, if you had a child that had a mental disorder, an obvious mental disorder at birth or even later on, that child would be taken away from you. So if you gave birth to a child with Down syndrome, that child doesn't go home from the hospital. It goes to a state facility where it's raised in a mental institution. And Dorothea Dix goes into these places, and it's like the conditions aren't for humans. You wouldn't expect to see them for dogs. So this woman is working really hard to make sure we have better care for the mentally ill, make sure mental hospitals are adequate in providing them with human needs. So she's got a big heart, a very kind woman. Thomas Gallaudet, a school for deaf children. Prior to Thomas Gallaudet, children who were deaf weren't just called deaf, they were called deaf and dumb. Because think about it for a minute. If you have no hearing, how difficult it is to learn anything. If you have no sight, you can hear everything, and you can, I guess, I don't exactly know how that works, but you can use imagination of some sort to picture in your mind how things are if you can't see anything. But if you're deaf, communication's really hard. So we start using sign language and figuring out that they aren't dumb, they just have to be taught in a different way. So we can thank Thomas Gallaudet for that. Or Samuel Howe, Asylums for the Blind. Today we don't, there are schools for the blind, but we try really hard to not have to send students off to schools like that. They're typically places where you go live. So we have a student in our grade that can't see anything, and he actually does fairly well. Needs more help than many of you, but he does very well, and he'll be an independent liver at some point. He'll take care of himself, and he'll have a job. And thank you to Samuel Howe for making an understanding that we have to teach in different ways for people who have some sort of a disadvantage or a disability. We also begin to see a movement towards abolishing slavery. That movement has existed, but it's a growing movement. So recognizing that humans don't belong as property to other humans, and protesting the use of slaves. So we're moving things in the right direction. Everything about this chapter is fixing problems within our society. And maybe that starts with even looking at Shakers or utopian societies and maybe thinking, yeah, we could just do better on our own without forming perfect societies. Abolitionist, person who wants to do away with slavery. We also begin to see people that are pushing abolition. We have Frederick Douglass, who is an escaped slave who moves into the North, and he's very educated, educates himself, and uses politics to try to do away with slavery. So as we get into the Civil War, Frederick Douglass has an indelible impression on Abraham Lincoln. Or Sojourner Truth. Her real name was not Sojourner. Sojourner is one out on a journey. Her real name was Isabella Baumfree. But she's doing the same thing. They're escaped slaves that are speaking out to help other enslaved people. And then we got the ultimate of the brave. We've got Harriet Tubman, who's a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She makes, I don't know for sure, but like 22 trips back into the heart of the South to help slaves escape. This woman has ice in her veins. She is deadly serious about her role, and she's not afraid. And there are bounties on Harriet Tubman's head. If the Southerners capture her, you get a huge reward for turning Harriet Tubman in, and she would be executed very, very publicly for doing what she did. So this woman in and of herself was responsible for the freeing of 200 plus slaves. Very, very brave woman. That's the reason probably, at least last time I heard, that she's going to replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. So if we're looking at a true American hero, in American history. We have a lot of them to look at. They're not oftentimes showcased because American history, for most of history, is written by men for men. So oftentimes the women in their role have been left out and left to the side, but Harriet Tubman is one of those for sure. Very fearless woman. These are the routes of the Underground Railroad, and you notice a lot of them lead all the way to Canada. So even getting to the north wasn't necessarily a safe place because you could still be returned into slavery. And women's rights, we got these three beauties here. Lucretia. That'd be Horace's sister, right? Lucretia. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. These are also very powerful women who are pushing for women's rights. And suffrage. Suffrage is kind of a weird, cruel, creepy word that sounds like to make a person suffer. It actually means the right to vote. So these women are fighting to get women the right to vote. It doesn't happen until 1920, so ladies have only had the right to vote in this country for about 100 years, 102 years. So, and it starts with these women who have the guts to speak out against the cruelty of men who won't allow them their enfranchisement or their suffrage. So these are great leaders in the women's rights movement for equality. Doesn't mean women weren't equal in some places. We just talked about in Shaker communities, women were seen as equals. But in most parts of America, that's not the case. It's a male-dominated history.
Any other animal species, the women or like the female counterpart is dominant.
I suppose you're right.
Like females are pretty like and guys are just there chilling.
You think even gorillas, because I watch
Yeah.
shows on gorillas, and those male gorillas, they're pretty bad dudes.
Just ward off to protect the pregnant.
Yeah, you're probably right.
I'm really
I don't
good
know.
at doing nothing.
You're good at doing nothing?
Yep.
So you'd be a good male gorilla?
Yep.
Or
I like to think of
male
myself as
human?
a big ape.
Yeah, I don't know. That's interesting. The most developed of all species, and yet the least developed of all species. Anyway, there are some beauties, by the way. Maybe that's Edward's wife in 30 years.
No. That's a fossil.
Oh.
Edward goes to college and he starts hanging out at the care home just because
No.
that's where the ladies
No.
are. Like, how old are you and are you sick?
That's,
Is it too late to get in your will?
that's a
Edward, I know how you
That's
think.
a Taurus.
All right, I'm going to shut her down for today and hand out your test. I'll go over some instructions on the test. So those of you that might be listening to the video, we're cutting you off now. Come in and get your test for me when you get back to school.